Hi there, my name is Nick Karpowitz, and I'm a scientist at the Max Planck Institute of Quantum Optics near Garching in Germany. And I wrote some open source software called Lightwave Explorer, which allows you to do simulations of nonlinear optics and various types of materials, mostly nonlinear optical crystals. And I wanted to give kind of a tutorial on how to use the software and first start off with a bit of information about where it came from, what it's based on, how it works, that sort of thing. So I wrote it a couple of years ago in order to understand a few different experiments that have been going on in our research group. I'll put some links to the papers in the description below, but the basic idea is we were doing all sorts of different nonlinear processes and different materials, and I wanted one base of code that I could use for doing all of these different simulations, such that when I do one experiment and I compare the results of this experiment versus the simulation, and I do another experiment and compare the results versus simulation, that I can make sure that they are sort of coherent with each other, that I can use the same code base to simulate everything, such that every time I do a new simulation to correspond to a new experiment, it provides a cross-check for this. So then as time goes on, more and more I can believe the results of the simulation. So one of the first things that we did was looking at nonlinear propagation of short light pulses in titanium dioxide crystal, which goes under some fairly complicated nonlinear optical processes, including some filamentation and self-compression inside. And the result, once all of the physics that I thought were necessary were included, it agreed pretty well. So here's spectrum of the simulation compared to the experiment, and it worked out pretty well. We did some other things, difference frequency generation, and other nonlinear processes like that. And over time, I think the code works pretty well. Other groups around the world, not just ours, have been using it. Here's the result from Imperial College London, where they're doing cascaded second harmonic generation. So I think it works, and it's worth learning how to use. So that's what this tutorial is about. So first, let's talk about what's going on under the hood. In numerical photonics, most of the time we're solving some partial differential equation. Inside of Lightwave Explorer, there are two main partial differential equations that we want to solve. One being the unidirectional pulse propagation equation, UPPE, which looks like this. And this is derived under the assumption that light is propagating primarily in one direction, which in a lot of nonlinear crystals, this is a valid assumption. So it works pretty well. It's efficient. One thing that doesn't get right is reflections. If you have significant reflections at the front or back surface of the crystal, you might have to take some precautions about this. But if you want to include nonlinear reflections intrinsically, you should use a different propagation mode, which is finite difference time domain propagation, or FTTD. This allows you to have not only reflected waves, but more complicated geometries of the material. So if you have some small structure and you want to simulate scattering within this small structure as nonlinear optical processes are going on, then you can do this. FTTD is just solving Maxwell's equations on a grid. And if you want to learn a little bit more about what's going on inside the simulation, I also wrote a paper about it, which is also open access, linked below if you want to read in more of a scientific journal. It was in Optics Communications a little while ago. So in order to get started, the first thing you'll need to do is go to the repository where I keep the code. That's also linked below. It's here on GitHub. The first thing you'll see is the actual source code if you're interested in looking into that. But if you just want to install it, you can just scroll down and there's instructions for Windows, Linux, Mac, however you want to use it. I also have some YouTube tutorials, which you've already found. In the rest of the README, there's a little bit more detail, and there's also a link to documentation with a bit more information about specific functions within the code. So I won't go into detail about how to install it yourself, but the information is here on the README. I think the best way to learn how to actually use the code is to just play around with it. So I'm going to show you how to start. So let's go to Lightwave Explorer. So when you open it, this is what you'll see, and I'll talk a little bit about all of the elements that you see on the screen here. So first thing that I'm going to do, just to make something show up, is to hit the run button. So by default, when you load it, there's a demo simulation that will just run given the input parameters here. And what it's actually solving is optical parametric amplification. What's going on here? If you look on the top left, there are 2 columns. Each of these is describing a optical pulse, so an ultra short laser pulse. And the OPA here, there are 2 pulses, a stronger pump pulse and a weaker seed pulse. And the whole point of optical parametric amplification is that energy is transferred from the strong pulse to the weak pulse. And that's what we're simulating here. So in the first column, we have all of the properties of the pump pulse, including its pulse energy. You can see it's 14 microjoules here. And it's centered at 876 terahertz with a bandwidth of 3.5 terahertz. So this is a fairly long ultraviolet pulse, which is going to pump a visible OPA. And so we control the properties of the shape of the spectrum with these 3 values here. This SG order is going to tell you the super Gaussian order. So if it's 2, it's just a nice Gaussian normal distribution. And if you make this higher, in this case 4, it's more of a flat top spectrum. So it's a super Gaussian spectrum. And one thing you'll notice is if you hover your mouse cursor over any of these values, it will give you a little bit more information about what each value means. All right, so the first value is energy. The next 3 are describing the shape of the spectrum. And then we have a few that are going to describe the spectral phase of the pulse. Spectrum, it's complex valued. You can think of these first 4 values as being all of the first 4 elements of a Taylor series expansion of your phase around the central frequency. The offset term is a carrier envelope phase, followed by a time delay. So you can shift your pulse in time. And then the next 2 are describing the group delay dispersion, or the chirp of the pulse, and the 3rd order dispersion, the sort of first higher order dispersion term. And then after that, we have 2 values here, which are allowing you to apply the phase of a known material to your pulse. So for example, if you start with a pulse which is transform limited short pulse, then you can simulate the effect of passing it through a certain amount of glass or something like that if you need to simulate how that is going to affect a measurement. And this is going to use the full Sellmeier equation describing whatever glass you use as defined in the database of materials in Lightwave Explorer. And then the next few terms here are describing the mode of the light. So we're assuming a Gaussian mode with a certain beam waist, so this W0 parameter of your Gaussian beam. And we have 2 offsets for the position of the focus. The X offset is a lateral offset of the beam on the spatial grid, and the Z offset here is shifting the focus of the pulse from the surface of the nonlinear crystal. So if this is set to 0, the light is going to be focused on the front surface of the nonlinear crystal. And if you shift it positive or negative, you can shift the focus inside or before the surface of the crystal. And then finally, we have a non-collinear angle. So we can change the angle of the light such that it isn't propagating along the z-axis of the simulation. And we're using that here in the OPA because we want a small angle between the pump and the seed in the OPA. And then next we have a few parameters that are describing the polarization of the light. Circularity here is describing if it's linear, which corresponds to 0, or circular, which corresponds to 1, or elliptical, which is somewhere in between. And the polarization angle, it's clear what it means for linear polarization. You see here we have orthogonal polarization of our pump and seed going into the OPA. And that describes the 2 input pulses that we're putting in to the OPA. And you'll notice here that there's this source pull down. Synthetic here means that it just takes these values, puts them in, and uses the pulse that describes. If we want to use external input data, we can do that as well. You can import data from Frog, so frequency resolved optical gating. It's a common way of measuring an ultra-short pulse. You can give it a waveform file, so just very simple file format of 2 columns, the first one being time in seconds, and the second one being the amplitude of the electric field as a function of time. And the last one is Lightwave Explorer, so you can take the result, one simulation, and add it in as an input pulse for another simulation. And then on the other side, up here, we have all the parameters that are describing the nonlinear medium and all of the parameters that are describing the numerical grid on which we're going to propagate this light. First, we have a pull down to select the material. So I have quite a few crystals that have been added to the database here. I'm always adding more as they come up. The crystal database is just a text file, which is more or less human readable. I even have a online worksheet for adding extra crystals, which I wrote another tutorial about. There are quite a few crystals there. It's fairly easy to add more. This button here is if you make a custom crystal database to load your database rather than the one that's built in. Following that, we have our 2 angles describing the... Normally, if you buy a crystal, you will have these angles theta and phi, which describe the direction of the surface normal of the crystal. So it's the orientation of light propagation relative to the system of coordinates of the crystal itself. These are used for phase matching and for maximizing the nonlinear coefficients based on the tensor nature of the nonlinearities. So that's included here. So you just put in the angles and it will take care of that. The next 4 values here are describing nonlinear absorption and the generation of a plasma. You'll see here that this first parameter is set to 0, which means it's not actually going to use this for this propagation. I would only use this if you are propagating at fairly high intensities inside of your nonlinear crystal, such that it is doing multiphoton absorption and generating a plasma. This is designed to take care of that, but it will make your life more difficult if you don't need it. So if it's set to 0, then all of this nonlinear plasma stuff is going to be turned off. If you set it to something non-zero, then you have to take care of these other parameters. So this first one here, the 6, is telling us the band gap of the crystal. You'll need this together with this number here, the frequency of the first pulse, in order to determine the order of multiphoton absorption inside the crystal. And once you have multiphoton absorption, typically you're going to be making free carriers and you have to describe the plasma response as well. This is just done with these 2 parameters describing a simple Drude model. The first one is a momentum relaxation rate, and the second one is the effective mass relative to the free electron effective mass. And then after that, we have our numerical grid. This is described in both space and time. For each of these, we have to give a length and a resolution. So we're saying how wide is the grid, this max X, and the resolution for describing the grid. Then following that, we have our length in time, followed by the resolution in time. And then finally, we have the z direction of the propagation, which is also a spatial dimension, but it is handled a little bit differently, especially in the UPPE kind of propagation, where this is telling us how thick the crystal that we want to propagate through is. And then also we have our step size for the nonlinear propagation through this crystal. So these all together will describe the numerical grid. I'll talk a little bit more how to actually choose the numerical grid properly. But first, let's look at the rest of these parameters here. So next we select our propagation mode. There are a few different ones here. These first 3 are using the unidirectional pulse propagation equation. This 2D Cartesian is the simplest one to run, but it is making an assumption that you can describe this problem in 2D, which doesn't work very well, for example, if you have tight focusing of your beams. The 3D radial symmetry mode is a three-dimensional propagation, but under the assumption that the problem you're solving has radial symmetry. So if you have a Gaussian beam in an isotropic medium, this is valid. If you have strong focusing in a birefringent medium, this is not going to be valid anymore. And obviously you can't introduce an angle between two different beams in this mode. And then after that, there's the full 3D mode, which will solve anything, but at the cost of requiring more memory and more time in order to complete the simulation. And then following that, we have our FDTD modes, both 2D and 3D for that. But for now, we'll stick with the 2D Cartesian just to get a feeling for how things work. Following that, I think when I hit run here, you can understand what's going on now. It's taking this pulse and this pulse, putting it on the grid, and showing the results that come out. So now let's talk a little bit more about what it's actually showing us here. You can see there's a whole bunch of plots that have different meanings, bit different information contained inside. So let's start with these two in the corner here. These are a space versus time view. You can see it's x in millimeters versus time in femtoseconds. This is just a slice for the electric field projected onto a grid. So you can just see the shape of the pulse in space and time. You can see there's some interesting spatio-temporal saturation effects going on inside of this OPCPA. And then next to that, we have essentially what's the Fourier transform of this. We have it versus transverse momentum. You can see the units are 1/microns now. And the x-axis is frequency in terahertz. So we can see our pump frequency up here, and our seed is down here. And you can see some other things coming out too. This one here is the idler of the OPA. So this is another wave which is generated during the optical parametric amplification process. This is also on a log scale, so it makes it easier to see all of the smaller parasitic effects that might be happening in your OPA. Below that, we have an image of the beam in false color. This is essentially what you would see if you were to put a piece of paper after the OPA to look at the output. The different colors, the red, green, and blue in this image correspond approximately to the colors that your eyes would see. Now you can adjust the properties of this image by going down here to this button with the two arrows on it to pop out the controls for the plot. In here, you can also turn on and off the different parts of the plotting. So what we can do is we can turn off these images at the top in order to have a bigger view of this beam here. This beam is in the far field, right? So this is what we would see with a screen far away from the crystal. That's why the two dimensions are both angles. We can also look at the distribution in the near field. So how the light would look if you put the piece of paper directly after the nonlinear crystal by going to this view here, going to near field, and hitting render, right? So here, all the light is mostly still overlapping inside of the crystal, so you just see one white spot. It hasn't spread out yet, but if we go into the far field, you'll see all of the light spread out. And if you want to change which colors correspond to red, green, and blue, you're free to do that. For example, if we want to make the red somewhere in the mid-infrared, we can say set that to 100 terahertz, which is about 3 microns. And you see it sort of disappears because there's no light there. But you can use this for examining different frequency ranges. Finally, at the bottom here, we have our wave and spectra views. So this waveform, if I turn on these slice images again, it's really just taking a cut through 0 here for X and Y polarizations, right? So this is the field in the X polarization. This is a field in the Y polarization. It's just plotting a slice at X equals 0 because sometimes it's just nice to see the waveform. And then next to that, we have the integrated spectra. So these are plotted also with real units, joules per terahertz versus frequency here. And here down at the bottom, we see the output spectrum of the signal and the idler. You can see how much energy was transferred to the signal and idler from the pump pulse here. We can put these all into one plot in order to compare the amplitudes a bit more easily. And we can, using these controls here, put fixed limits for the plot. So if you wanted to just look at, say, the near infrared and visible spectral range where our signal and idler are, we just put in the numbers there, and we can see our signal and our idler plotted together. So now what we can do is I'll go click this again to go back to the normal control. One thing that is very useful to do in this kind of simulation is to sweep one of these parameters and see how the results change. For example, one thing that we can do is we can change this non-collinear angle. You can see all of these parameters that are up here are available in this batch mode. So if we select non-collinear angle, what it'll do is it will do however many steps we specify here. Let's say we do 5 steps, and it is going to change this value continuously from the starting value, which is whatever we put in here, to the final value that we enter here. So we're starting at 0.45 and the target is 0, and it will go there in 5 steps. So now if I hit run, you can see it does 5 simulations, right? And we can use this slider down here to flick through these and see how the results change. So here what I'm doing is I'm changing the non-collinear angle of the OPA and looking at how the conversion efficiency, the spectrum, and all of those things change. And this is a very nice way of getting a feeling for a process. So if you want to see how things change, this is a very visual way of inspecting the differences that it's going to make. You can do 2 batch scans at the same time. So for example, if we wanted to see how the OPA would change if we were to change the non-collinear angle and the pulse energy, we can do that. We can set energy 1 to, I don't know, so 1e minus 5. So we'll change it from 14 to 10. We'll just do 2 scans. And then if we do 2, now it's going to do 10 simulations, right? 5 angles, 2 powers, and they're all going to be displayed here, right? And we can see all of these results. It shows us down here what the combination of values are, right? And so this makes it very easy to scan through the results and see how things are going to change. That's cool. That's a good start. Now, the next thing you should be wondering is, how do I know that the numerical simulation I just ran is actually valid? And a big part of that is numerical convergence. So I want to talk a little bit before we go on about what it means for a numerical simulation to be converged, at least in the context of these numerical optical simulations where we're really solving a partial differential equation on a grid. Our nonlinear optics, the way that we think of them in Maxwell's equations, the electric field and things like that, these are continuous variables, right? But we have to represent them on a numerical grid somehow, which is a discrete set of numbers, right? And not only that, so there's some approximation based on whatever resolution we use to describe this. We also need to do derivatives, right? We need to do some calculus on these things. The way that we do this is through finite difference expressions. The trick here is we start with the Taylor series expression of whatever thing we want to know. And once we've done our representation on a numerical grid, we can identify, so for example, in the lowest order finite difference expression, we can identify, if we write out the Taylor series expansion, that if we know the values at different points, the relationship between these values is determined by the derivative, right? And then we just shuffle these terms around and we get the derivative out. But in order to do this, we've made some assumptions. We've basically thrown away higher order terms in this Taylor series expansion. And those higher order terms then determine the error of the numerical approximation that we're making to the derivative. And these errors will show up in our simulation. We know how they change versus parameters that we can control. So we can find out, well, are these errors dominating the answer that I'm getting to whatever question I'm asking the numerical simulation. So really in the end, what we need to do is we need to look at some observable quantities about the simulation and make sure that they're not changing as we change properties of how we set up our numerical grid, as long as the properties of the numerical grid shouldn't affect the result. So in Lightwave Explorer, you can see here, if we look at our description of the grid, there are a few things that are going to be important to converge. And I've intentionally chosen this sort of demo set of numbers such that it's not quite perfectly converged. It's converged enough that you get the qualitative result correctly, but if you really want to get some more digits behind that, you have to do a bit more work. So let's first see how to identify a numerical grid which isn't perfect and how to fix it. I'm going to mainly talk about these 5 numbers here. Each one of these describes the box around the electromagnetic field we've constructed, and we project this continuously varying electric field onto this numerical grid. So we have our spatial grid here, these first 2, and our time grid here. So let's talk about the spatial grid first. Both of these numbers are relevant. The size of the box is maybe easier to understand. It has to be big enough to contain the electric field. We don't want it leaking outside the box. We don't want it hitting the edges of the box. And the resolution is going to determine how finely detailed can this electric field be as a function of space. We're going to need a smaller step size, so a more resolution if we're, for example, focusing more tightly, or if we're sending our beams at different angles inside of the nonlinear crystal. The best way to check your spatial grid is to looking at these 4 plots here, the ones on the top. And actually the momentum space representation is usually the most obvious due to the fact that it's presented on a log scale, and sometimes the frequency domain is just more indicative of what's going on. The first thing that we'll notice is that the box is too small. You might not see that from the electric field here, right? But this is on a linear scale. If we look on the momentum space representation, around the pump, we see this very indicative sort of bloom around pulse. This effect where you have this line coming out is due to the fact that the pump pulse is actually getting clipped a little bit on the edges. We can make this go away by making this spatial grid larger. So I just turned off the batch mode. Now let's watch what happens to this bloom around the pump pulse. If I change the size of the grid from 384 to 640 microns. You can see most of the simulation is the same, but that bloom disappeared. So this will tell us, if you see that kind of structure, probably your box is too small. One thing you'll notice is if we're looking at an observable like the spectrum, that didn't actually change anything. If I go back to 384 here, right? If you watch the spectrum down here, the spectrum is identical. So it wasn't so relevant for whatever conclusions we might be drawing about the operation of the OPA, but it is kind of relevant if we want a result that we can adjust a little bit. As it was set up, it works fine for producing this spectrum, but if we wanted to change something else, it might not work as we've expected. While we're playing around, let's keep it at a bit more generous grid size. You'll notice that this makes the simulation run a little bit more slowly. It hasn't gotten relevant yet, but as your grid gets larger and larger, you will notice that the simulation will be quite slow. So that's how we pick the box size. That's more straightforward. How we pick the resolution is a little bit more detailed. And this actually, again, is easier to look at in Momentum. The resolution here is going to determine how big the box is in Momentum space. And you can see in Momentum, it's maybe reaching uncomfortably close to the edge of the grid. And the way to fix that is to actually make the step size smaller. So we can go just make it smaller by a factor of 2. We'll use 1 micron steps and see how it changes. All right, so now everything fits nicely inside of the box. Again, this is on a log scale, so if it goes to 0, it's really empty out there. You'll notice again that this spectrum didn't change when I changed that step size. So again, it's not too relevant for us because we know that these 2 spots correspond to these 2 spots, which are well within the center of the grid. But if we were really concerned about what some of these other parasitic processes we're doing, we'd want to make sure that the grid is big enough to describe them. So the next things that I want to talk about are the time grid and the propagation step size for the UPPE. The time grid, again, the size, I think we have a better feeling for this. We just want to make the grid big enough that the pulse fits inside. And you can see this one is actually a little bit too short. Maybe I'm going to make this 512 femtoseconds long instead. You can run this. You can see now it's getting a little bit slower, and now our light nicely fits within the grid. You usually want to have a condition more like that. If you look at the spectrum, once we start looking at changes in the time grid, it gets a little bit harder to interpret because we are going to change how these points are discretized. So you have to sort of think about what is the shape of the curve, not the position of the actual points on the grid. Now the next thing that I want to do is actually this value. So our step size as we propagate through the crystal, because this is probably the most important one. You want to make this small enough such that the propagation is nicely converged and you don't have any runaway artifacts that are appearing. The way that you check this is, again, you just make it smaller and you make sure nothing changes. So if I change this to 250, I can run it again. Now you can see it's getting quite a bit slower, right? Because I have a much more detailed grid. There were a few things that changed. Again, it didn't make a big difference in the spectrum, but it made a little bit of a difference in the spectrum. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just keep making this smaller until I'm really sure that nothing is changing. And this 125 here is good. Just to make it a little more obvious, we can go to like a really big step and you can see all of the errors that are going to pop up there. And now it changed it enough that it was actually relevant for the result. So we want to stay well away from that. Making this smaller, so go back to 125. You really want to be in the range where you can double this and you get the same result, because then you know that you're safe. You don't have any numerical errors that are going to be dominating the results of your simulation. And then let's talk about this number here, the time resolution. This one can be a bit tricky because obviously you still just want to be able to make this as small as possible. However, making your time resolution smaller means that you're including higher frequencies on the numerical grid. This can sometimes be a problem depending on how your nonlinear optical crystal is described in terms of its refractive index. Quite a lot of expressions in the literature for refractive index are based on a Sellmeier equation, which has a certain range of validity. And if you go outside of this range into higher frequencies, sometimes you get very absurd values of the refractive index, and these can be very difficult to include inside of a numerical simulation. So it can be that by having a sort of more coarse step size here, you exclude frequency components of the light, which one, are not going to be treated correctly anyway, because the refractive index in the literature is just not well defined, but they also cause quite a lot of numerical instability. So what I can do here is I can go a little bit smaller, say 0.25, and I'll run the simulation based on this, and we should get a pretty similar result in terms of the spectrum that's going to come out. You can see again the dots moved around, but I get the same overall spectrum. And what I'm doing is I'm including more high frequency components up here. And these high frequency components are the most difficult things to include on the grid because they have the largest value of the K vector. High values of K vector are typically the most difficult to include in the numerical grid. Now you'll see if I go back up to this value where we started for the step size, the simulation is going to fail completely. So if I say run, it will just say that it detected not a number on the grid. And that's because these higher frequency components are very unstable. So you have to be cautious if you're including them on your grid. However, if you have a small enough step size and enough patience, you can get reasonable results for even crystals that have marginally bad values in the ultraviolet. So this is what you should do to converge a numerical simulation. I would say first check that the input electric field fits well within the box. To check the input, you can just put max z to 0. This is going to show you the pulse which is entering the numerical simulation. So you just want to make your box big enough that everything is going to fit inside. And when you run the simulation, you can make sure that it also still fits. Then if you're getting a result, make sure that you can make all of these numbers smaller, all of these resolutions smaller, and still get the same result. And if you get something which isn't returning anything, you get this not a number error. The main thing to do, check in the crystal database where the Selmayr coefficients, where the refractive index data came from. Try to exclude high frequencies that aren't valid anyway on this grid. That means make this step size coarser. And if you have good values and it's still not converging, then you make this step size smaller. Eventually you should find a set of parameters where everything is going to work. Make sure you're looking at some relevant observable, such as the spectrum, where you want to measure the spectrum, and then you should be safe. So the next thing that I want to look at is some of the more advanced functions that are included in Lightwave Explorer. You can see two big empty boxes here, one here and one here. These are used for fitting and for sequences. So I'll talk about them one after the other. So let's do fitting first. It's often the case that you want to adjust your parameters in order to maximize some aspect of the output. So I have a demo calculation that I'll just load here. So in this demo, you can see I've just loaded a bunch of input parameters, and it is looking at second harmonic generation inside of a BBO crystal. So let's look at the full spectral range. So we are looking at the generation of second harmonic of an 800 nanometer pulse inside of a BBO crystal. There are different things that we might want to optimize about this. In this case, we want to optimize power in the second harmonic. Let's do this to find good values for the phase matching angles. So you'll notice here, okay, I have some value here, 5.4 times 10 to the minus 14. If I put in 0, so we're setting theta equals to 0, most of that amplitude has disappeared, right? So these values, theta and phi, will be very important for giving us a high amplitude of our second harmonic generation. And for BBO crystal at 800 nanometers, we know these numbers very well. It should be 29.2 degrees for theta and 30 degrees for phi, or 90 degrees, almost equivalent. So we could either calculate these by hand. It's not that hard to do for a uniaxial crystal like BBO. We could try to scan around, just optimize by hand, but the simulation can do this for us. We just have to tell it what to optimize and what to search for. And this is what we do in this box here. These are all the parameters of our fitting routine. So how does this work? What am I telling it to do? And then we'll run it and see what comes out. The first thing that we have to do is tell it what to optimize. And that's what's going on here with this maximize X, maximize Y, maximize total, fit spectrum. What we want to do is we want to say optimize the power in either the X polarization or the Y polarization, or I don't care what the polarization is, I just want to maximize the power. In this case, I know that I want it to show up on the extraordinary axis of the crystal, so I just want to say maximize the power on the x-axis of the crystal. Next thing I have to do is tell it which frequency range do you want to optimize the power inside of. That's what these two numbers here are. So these are in hertz, the frequency. So I'm telling it to optimize from 720 terahertz to 780 terahertz. This corresponds to the second harmonic of this 800 nanometer pulse. And this last number here on this line is how many simulations do we want to allow it to do in order to figure out the result. If we let it do more simulations, it will get a better result, but it will take longer. The next thing, we have a semicolon, and then on the next line, we put in 3 more numbers. And this is telling it which parameter to adjust, and then the range in which it can adjust it. So 29, why is it 29? If you go into the batch mode list, you'll see there's a number corresponding to all of the values that are determining our simulation. So 29 is the theta angle of the crystal. 30 is the phi angle of the crystal. See? So what I'm telling it to do is to search over 300 simulations for the combination of theta and phi, which is going to optimize the generation of this second harmonic. Right, so this is how I set up the command inside of this box here, and I hit fit, and it runs all of those simulations, and it will tell me the result that it found. So it says the first value, which for us is theta, should be 29.2. And the second value, which is phi, should be 30 degrees. So this is what we'd expect for a BBO crystal. You can see that it's 29.899, right? Because it's not perfect. We did a sort of finite number of simulations. If we increase this number, it probably will get a little bit better, but it gets 29.2 and 30. So it is finding the right values of our angle. And we can do this for whatever other things that we want. If you had, for example, a more complicated system like that OPCPA we were looking at before, we can look at things like the non-collinear angle, and we can have it adjust these to optimize different aspects of nonlinear optics for us. So that's our simulation of second harmonic generation inside of a crystal. We've optimized the angle for generating second harmonic. What if we wanted to do something a little bit more complicated? We wanted to say put 2 crystals one after the other to do cascaded third harmonic generation. So to do first in one crystal second harmonic generation, and then in a second crystal third harmonic generation by some frequency mixing of the second harmonic. If we want to describe 2 different crystals, how do we do that? We essentially want to feed the output of one simulation into the next. That's what the sequence mode down here is for. Let's look a little bit about how this works. I'm first going to make my time grid a little bit finer, which is also, as we learned before, going to require a smaller step in space here, but that's all fine. I have a finer time grid, right? And I need this for describing my third harmonic. How do I describe 2 crystals? First thing that I want to do is put in a copy of this crystal that I've already found to be kind of optimal. And maybe I want to make this a little bit thicker. Let's do like a 500 micron crystal. All right, so you can see it's making a more narrowband pulse, but it's converting a little bit more. I can click this button here, and it's going to fill in some text for me. And really, this is what the sequence mode is. It's a way of scripting the simulation. And we're scripting it in terms of different operations that are going to take place on the same electromagnetic field. So what we're saying here is we're going to do a nonlinear propagation through this BBO crystal. We're going to have this function, which is described in the documentation, with these parameters. We're telling it the index of the crystal, we're telling it theta and phi, we're telling it how thick it is, and we're telling it the step size, and it's going to run it in this crystal with these parameters. So if I hit run, it's going to give me the same result that we had before. Now the next thing you'll notice is if I change it on the interface now, it's always going to give the same results, because if there is something in this sequence, it's always going to run this sequence. How do I deal with that? You can replace most of the numbers here with the letter D, which just means to defer to the interface. So now if I have a D in there for the thickness, it's going to take whatever value I put in on the interface here, right? And now what I can do is I can run two different crystals, two back to back. So if I have, say, two crystals that are 250 microns thick, I should get the same result as having one which is 500 microns thick and another which is 0 microns thick. And you can see I do. So what I can do, and what I've done here, is I have two nonlinear crystals back to back. How do I find something which is going to give me the third harmonic? I can say I would like to fit theta and phi of the second crystal here, right? So now theta and phi of the second crystal are going to be determined by the interface again. Like now if I put another 500 microns here, if I keep going, it's like having a thicker nonlinear crystal. And you can see now it's starting to run off the edge of the grid. So what I need to do, let's make our spatial grid a little bit larger, right? To contain all of our stuff. So now I have two crystals that are both 500 microns long. Maybe I need a longer time grid here too. Two crystals that are 500 microns long. Right now, they're both doing second harmonic generation of 800 nanometers, right? But that's not really what we wanted. We want to do second harmonic generation in the first crystal, but now we want to do some frequency generation in the second crystal. So what I'm going to do, just to make this easy, is I want to use a type 2 process. So I want to have my second crystal in BBO type 2 corresponds to phi equals 0, and I can take off that line for the fitting. And now I want to say, find the angle theta, which is going to find maximum third harmonic. So let's look in a range from 1100 to 1150 and adjust the value of theta between 0 and 90 degrees. I've changed this a little bit. So now we want to find the right conditions for phase matching of some frequency generation between 800 nanometers and 400 nanometers in this second crystal. First, we have to put in our third harmonic spectral range, and we want to maximize for the total. I've set in the phi of a type 2 crystal because I want to use a type 2 interaction because I have orthogonal inputs to my my sum frequency, and I want to find the corresponding value of theta for phase matching. I want to modify this sequence a little bit more for phase matching to work out, which is I need to rotate, which means that I want to put in the second crystal, I want its ordinary and extraordinary axes to be 90 degrees different than the first crystal. And this rotate function will handle that. I can run this simulation. I'm going to just use a thinner crystal just so it doesn't take so much time to run the simulation. And then we will just say fit. And now it's going to run, again, 300 simulations with these two crystals, taking the output of one, putting it into the other, and it's changing the theta values of this crystal here, and then we'll see what it comes up with for the second crystal. So it found something. If you look in K, you can see our fundamental and third harmonic. So we're generating orthogonally polarized fundamental and second harmonic, and then the third harmonic is showing up on the same axis as the fundamental. I've put the spectrum onto a log plot here, just with this checkbox here, because the third harmonic is pretty weak. It makes it easier to see. But we're generating third harmonic here. It told us that we want a 55 degree or so angle, which for type 2 and BBO for generating ultraviolet is pretty reasonable. And now what we have in the sequence is one simulation which is doing all of these things, right? And these are now coupled. So we can see how the efficiency of generating our third harmonic is going to change if we change the thickness of the first crystal, right? So we can optimize all of these things together, and we can see, and this is especially important in nonlinear systems, how one part of our optical setup is going to change the results in the next part. Using sequences, you can see there's a lot of buttons here. There are lots of different things that you can do inside of a sequence. Look through the documentation. I have a list of most of the functions that you can use and how they work. So just play with them. There's stuff that you can do, like applying different filters, add additional pulses at different points in the propagation. You can even do for loops. So you can take the output and make it run through a subsequence several times. I've used this quite a lot. It's useful if you want to do, for example, periodically poled lithium niobate, because a periodically poled crystal is nothing but a sequence of crystals with inverted, effectively, orientation. So there's quite a lot that you can do with these sequences if you play around with them. Now, the next thing that we should look at is how do we process these results. So it's one thing to do the simulation, but maybe you want to import into Python in order to plot it together with data. So this is how you can do that. We're going to save these results. So what it does when it saves is it gave me a zip file. Inside of the zip file, there are a few different subfiles, including one which just gives us all of our simulation parameters, that sort of thing. And then we have our spectrum and electric field on a numerical grid. Next thing we want to do is to see how do we load these in Python. So what I have is a simple Marimo notebook here, and we're going to just load these results. On the Python package manager, so pip, you can do pip install Lightwave Explorer, and there's a package called Lightwave Explorer, which makes this fairly easy. So I'm importing it as LWE, and what I'll do is I will just make some output struct s, which is going to be lwe.load of our file. So this zip file that we just made. So we're going to load the zip file, and if I look at what's inside the class that comes out, I get quite a lot of information describing the results of the simulation. And if I show everything. You can see there's quite a few. But let's just look at one of them. So I'm going to use matplotlib to look at the spectrum. So inside of this struct, we have spectrum X, spectrum Y. These are the data that are down here in Lightwave Explorer, right? So the spectrum on the X-axis, spectrum in the Y-axis. And we have these available to us here in Python. So we can do spectrum X, and now we have this same value available to us in Python. So let's do semilog Y. You can see that it's the same information that we had in the Lightwave Explorer interface. So we have our spectra available. We also have our full electric field. So if we look at the ext underscore x and underscore y are again our two polarizations. Let me do rasterized equals true. This is our electric field function. So if you wanted to do more complicated data processing on the outputs of the simulation, all of the information that you need to describe the simulation is going to be provided to you simply by this lwe.load function, and you just give it this zip file. So hopefully that makes it easy to work with. All right, so that's everything that I wanted to cover in this tutorial. I think this gives you the tools that you need to start playing around, and I think that's really the best way to learn. Look up some papers that did some nonlinear interactions that you find interesting and see if you can reproduce them, or try to reproduce your own results if you're an experimentalist working in the lab with nonlinear optics. So I hope this was helpful. If you want to keep up to date with all of the Lightwave Explorer stuff that I'm showing, you can feel free to subscribe to this channel. If you like the video, it lets me know that I did an okay job with it. And if you have questions, feel free to leave comments here on YouTube or in the GitHub. So I hope you have fun playing with it, and have a nice day.